What would you do if the man who once destroyed your family's future asked you to help rebuild his own, not with an apology, not with regret, but with a contract? Evelyn Hartman has spent years cleaning up the mess others left behind, including the one Graham Callister made when he crushed her father's company without blinking. Now, with his empire on the edge of collapse, he turns to the one woman who has every reason to walk away and asks her to save it. She could say no. She should say no. But what if the only way to reclaim your power is to sit across from the man who once took it? Would you walk back into the same room that shattered you, just to prove you're no longer breakable? This isn't a story about forgiveness. It's about leverage, about choices made in silence and strength born in scars. If you've ever had to put your pain aside to protect something bigger, like share and subscribe to shining stories, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is face the past with your eyes wide open. Now, let's begin. The chandelier above the conference table flickered once, catching the morning light like a memory half remembered. It was too elegant for a building as clinical as Callister Global Headquarters, a relic from the founder's obsession with European opulence. Evelyn Hartman noticed it immediately as she stepped into the room, her heels barely making a sound on the polished floor. She had always thought it looked more like something you'd find in an opera house than a boardroom, but maybe that was the point. Theater, performance, illusion. 12 men in tailored suits turned at once, expressions shifting from confusion to discomfort to full-blown recognition. The room fell into that quiet that only money can command. In the far corner, standing with his back half-turned to the door, was Graham Callister. He didn't look over right away. Instead, he slowly stirred the coffee in his hand, the one habit Evelyn remembered from the headlines and shareholder meetings of 10 years past. Graham Callister didn't drink his coffee. He stirred it, slowly, as if trying to dissolve time itself. When he did turn, their eyes met across the width of the room, hers steady, gray-blue, and utterly unreadable, his sharp as winter sun, with a flicker of something not quite regret and not quite fear. "Ms. Hartman," he said finally, his voice smoother than she expected. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She set her leather-bound folder on the table, placed both palms beside it, and regarded him like one would an earthquake map coldly, calculating, as if waiting for the aftershocks. "I didn't come for you," she replied. "I came for what's mine." The youngest man at the table, maybe 35, face still etched with ambition, shifted awkwardly in his seat. Graham noticed, barely. The room had become a stage, and he, an actor too seasoned to flinch. "You mean your father's legacy," Graham said. A pause. "No." Evelyn answered, calm as a surgeon. "I mean my work. The software you buried after the acquisition. The patents that your team conveniently forgot to implement. The research you shelved because it didn't fit your quarterly narrative." The silence in the room thickened. Graham's jaw tightened a flicker, barely visible. He set the coffee down, untouched. "Your name wasn't on the paperwork. I was the one writing the code in his basement at 17 while you were shaking hands on golf courses." Another pause. This one felt heavier. "And now," Evelyn continued, taking her seat at the head of the table, "you need that code, isn't that right?" No one else spoke, not the lawyers, not the VP of Innovation, not even the compliance manager who had been nervously tapping a pen before she entered, because they all knew it was true. The merger deal with Colton Tech, a multi-billion-dollar alignment that would redefine global data encryption, was on the verge of collapse. Not because of money, not because of politics, but because of a clause buried deep inside an old technology patent, a clause that tied the licensing rights to Evelyn Hartman. They needed her signature, and she'd rather set the building on fire than hand it over for free. Outside, New Haven's sky darkened with the weight of an approaching storm. Wind whispered against the tall windows, tapping gently, as if nature itself waited to see what would unfold next. Evelyn's voice cut through the stillness again. "You reached out after 12 years of silence, Mr. Callister. Not when my father passed, not when you laid off his research team, not when the last functioning prototype disappeared from the lab without notice. Graham's expression didn't change, but he blinked. Once, slowly. I reached out, he said finally, because you're the only person who can save this. She tilted her head. Save you? You mean? He didn't deny it. It was almost admirable, she thought, the way he could admit vulnerability without ever actually appearing weak. That, perhaps, was his true genius. But Evelyn had spent over a decade turning herself into a different kind of genius, the kind that doesn't flinch when power speaks. You want my technology, she said. You'll get it. Under one condition. Graham raised an eyebrow, the smallest shift of weight toward the edge of curiosity. We build it again. From scratch. Together. And every line of code will bear both our names. A moment passed. Graham leaned forward slightly, as if to study her more closely. I thought you came to settle a score. I came to decide whether the cost of winning is worth what it takes to burn the whole house down. His gaze lingered on her face, searching. Perhaps, for the girl he'd once read about in financial tabloids, the daughter of Raymond Hartman, tech savant, an idealist. But Evelyn Hartman was no longer a girl. She was steel-wrapped and quiet, and grief tempered into glass. Outside, thunder rolled. And still, neither of them looked away. The tea in Evelyn's porcelain cup had long gone cold. She hadn't touched it, not since the moment she'd sat down. Across the table, Graham Callister stirred his coffee again, slow, absent, thoughtful. He didn't look at her, not directly, but she could feel the shift in the room, the discomfort of a man who was used to silence as a strategy, and now found himself disarmed by it. I read your proposal, she said finally, flipping open the folder that lay between them. Her tone was neutral, but not soft. It's comprehensive, ambitious, and terribly short-sighted. Graham's eyes flicked up, just once. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers like he was readying himself for a cross-examination. Short-sighted, how you want to retrofit quantum encryption into legacy infrastructure built for systems that barely understood AES 256. That's like pouring new wine into cracked clay. It won't hold. That's not what our engineers. Evelyn raised one hand, gently. Your engineers are skilled, but this technology wasn't meant to be squeezed into something old. It was meant to reinvent the architecture entirely. Silence. Not because he didn't have a response, but because she had touched a truth he hadn't wanted to admit out loud. The rest of the boardroom sat quiet, unsure whether to breathe. No one wanted to interrupt what had clearly turned into something bigger than business, something personal. Graham cleared his throat, voice tighter now. We don't have the luxury of time. If the Colton merger fails, we hemorrhage credibility. And if that happens, you stop being Graham Callister, the untouchable. Evelyn finished for him. You start becoming a cautionary tale, just like my father. The words landed like ice dropped in a warm drink, quiet but jarring. Graham inhaled slowly through his nose and let the moment hang. I didn't come here to rehash the past, he said. But that's what this is, Evelyn replied, softer this time. You're not just asking for technology. You're asking for the one thing you can't buy a second chance. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Her words were precise and scalpel sharp, honed by years of boardroom battles and long nights staring into lines of code written by hands that could barely stop shaking. Graham reached for his coffee, then stopped. You think this is about redemption? No, she said. I think it's about fear. You've built an empire on control. But now you need something. Someone you once tried to erase. She closed the folder with a quiet thud and stood. The storm had reached the windows now. Thick sheets of rain slapping against the glass in rhythmic protest. You know, she added, turning back toward him, I used to wonder what I'd say if we ever ended up in the same room again. Graham looked up at her, genuinely curious. And I didn't think I'd feel this calm. She walked to the door, each step deliberate, her figure reflected in the marble floor like a ghost from a life he barely remembered. Just before reaching the exit, she paused. One more thing. Graham waited. If we're going to rebuild this from the ground up, I want full access to the archives, every version of the prototype, every memo, every patent, every legal file. That wasn't in the proposal. He said, "It is now." "And what do I get in return?" he asked. His voice dipped in something heavier than sarcasm. It was almost vulnerable. Evelyn didn't smile. She simply met his gaze. And for a moment, there was nothing left between them but rain, silence, and memory. "You get a chance to prove you're not the man who destroyed my father." The door clicked shut behind her, inside the boardroom. Graham sat alone for a long time after the others had trickled out, murmuring excuses and grateful for the exit. The coffee had gone cold. The chandelier above flickered again, catching the reflection of a man who no longer recognized his own face. The smell of solder and coffee was the scent of Evelyn Hartman's childhood. Not birthday cake, not fresh grass or cinnamon rolls. No, it was the low hum of her father's workbench, the faint buzz of a circuit board warming under heat, and the way he'd gently tap his wedding ring against the ceramic mug while thinking. Evelyn remembered it clearly. Even now, especially now. She sat alone in the apartment she rarely visited, a dusty relic of her past, above the old warehouse her father once converted into a private lab. The storm still raged outside, but inside, everything was still, quiet in the way old grief tends to be. On the shelf above the mantel sat a single photograph. Her father, Raymond Hartman, in his lab coat, smiling crookedly at the camera. One hand held a circuit board like a trophy. The other rested on the shoulder of a girl just shy of 16, arms crossed, face defiant, and eyes full of wonder. "I don't want to be like everyone else," she'd told him once. "I want to build something that matters." He'd smiled then, slow and warm. That's the only thing worth building. The memory of those words hurt more than she'd expected. Evelyn stood, crossing the room to a tall filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. The lock was broken. Her father had never believed in locking away knowledge. "If you can't trust people with information," he used to say, "then maybe it's not the information that's dangerous." The bottom drawer stuck for a moment, then slid open with a reluctant groan. Inside were stacks of manila folders, diagrams, notebooks scribbled in two different hands, his and hers. At the very back, buried beneath early designs for something labeled Hartman Entanglement Layer Protocol. She found it. The letter, burned at one corner, edges curling like it had tried to escape the fire. She'd almost destroyed it after the acquisition, after the lawyers arrived, after Callister Global stripped everything they could find from Hartman Technologies and repackaged it under their own label. But something made her stop. A voice in the back of her head. Maybe, or guilt, or defiance, or love. She didn't know. All she knew now was that her father had never mailed the letter. "Dear Graham, you're a brilliant man. Ruthless, yes. But I see something of myself in you. That frightens me. Because I know where it leads if you're not careful. You acquired the skeleton of something. But the soul, you left that behind. I hope one day you realize what you missed. If Evelyn ever comes to you, and she might listen to her, she carries more than anger. She carries the part of this work that was built from love. And if she doesn't come to you, it's because you didn't deserve her trust in the first place." Evelyn read it 3 times, once with her eyes, once with her hands, tracing the words, and once with something inside her that couldn't be named, something too old for logic, too raw for language. She didn't cry. That was something she'd stopped doing after the funeral. Instead, she folded the letter gently and slid it back where it had lived for years, not because she was ready to let go, but because it reminded her of who she used to be before grief calcified into vengeance. Later that night, Evelyn found herself sitting at the foot of her father's old workbench, the soldering iron long cold, but the memories still glowing at the edges. She thought about Graham, about the way he'd sat still after she walked out of the conference room, about how his voice hadn't cracked not once, but something in his eyes had. She didn't trust him. She probably never would. But she remembered her father's words now. She carries the part of this work that was built from love. And maybe that was the part Graham could never steal, no matter how many patents he filed or companies he swallowed. Maybe that was her power, not control, not revenge, but the quiet strength of someone who still remembered how to build something from nothing, especially when everything else had been taken away. The temporary war room was set up in a corner of Callister Global's 37th floor, a space usually reserved for closed-door strategic meetings or high-value investor pitches. Now, it belonged to Evelyn and Graham. 3 walls of glass, 1 long conference table, 2 whiteboards already half covered in Evelyn's elegant, looping handwriting, and a digital timer on the corner screen, counting down from 72,000,000. 3 days. That's all they had to salvage the merger deal. 3 days to rebuild the presentation, redesign the tech strategy, and pretend they weren't 2 people standing on opposite sides of a 10-year-old battlefield. Graham arrived late by 2 minutes. Evelyn was already seated, her laptop open, sleeves rolled, hair tied back in a simple knot. The kind of look that didn't need to announce power. It just was. "You're late," she said without looking up. "It's 2 minutes," he replied, shrugging out of his coat. 2 minutes is enough time to crash a system, or save one. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched just slightly. They got to work. There were no pleasantries, no chit-chat, just the sharp click of keys and the occasional sound of a pen scratching across paper. Evelyn led the technical integration plan, mapping out architecture that no one in his company had fully understood before. Graham watched, listened, interjected carefully. She wasn't what he expected. He'd imagined her as cold, rigid, like so many brilliant minds, hardened by betrayal. But there was a fluidity to the way she thought, a quiet adaptability beneath the precision. When she spoke about layered encryption or dynamic scaling, her voice carried something rare belief. She didn't just want the technology to work, she wanted it to mean something. At hour 4, they disagreed loudly. "It won't scale," Graham said, frustration inching into his voice. "Your framework assumes a level of processor efficiency that most enterprise systems can't guarantee." Evelyn stood, moving to the whiteboard. "You're not listening. I'm not assuming efficiency. I'm engineering for imperfection. That's the breakthrough." Graham blinked. She drew a quick sketch, 3 tiers of nodes, a fault tolerance system, a dynamic rebalancing protocol. He stepped closer. "You designed this." "My father conceptualized it," she said. "I built it." The room fell quiet again. He wanted to say something, offer recognition, maybe even apology. But Evelyn had already turned back to the screen, typing fast, as if words from him would only slow her down. By hour 6, their assistant, Theo, a quiet, wide-eyed analyst barely out of grad school, poked his head into the room. "Ms. Hartman, Mr. Callister, I brought coffee and we're fine," they said in unison. Theo blinked, set the coffee down, backed out without another word. Outside the war room, the office moved like a machine meetings, calls, quiet chaos. But inside, time warped. 1 hour folded into the next. They barely spoke unless it was necessary. And yet, something was happening. A rhythm. They disagreed, often, but never mindlessly. Every clash was grounded in ideas, in logic, in the kind of mutual challenge that only happens when 2 people actually care about the outcome. And that's what scared Evelyn the most, not Graham's presence, but the part of herself that had started listening. That evening, the storm returned, less dramatic than the last, but persistent. The sky outside the glass darkened until the city lights below looked like constellations. Graham stood at the far end of the room, looking out at New Haven's skyline. Evelyn remained seated, eyes on her screen, though her fingers had stopped typing. Without turning, he asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Then she closed her laptop with a soft click. "No," she said simply, "because we didn't." He turned, leaning back against the glass. "I meant it as a compliment." "I know," she said. "That's the problem." Graham moved back toward the table. "This isn't easy for me. You know, working with me. No, realizing how much we got wrong." He looked at her, and for the first time that day, she looked back not with hostility, but with something closer to weariness. We both got things wrong, she said. The difference is, I never pretended otherwise. At 1:07 a.m., the timer read 53, 52, 12. The whiteboard was full. Their voices were hoarse, but the framework for the presentation was finally taking shape. They sat across from each other in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time in years, they didn't need to say it. Outside, rain tapped the glass. Inside, two adversaries sat in the middle of a battlefield. They were slowly rebuilding into a blueprint for something else. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of work. And in that silence, it was enough. Graham always poured his coffee the same way, left hand on the carafe, right hand steadying the cup, no sugar, no cream, just black a dark, bitter ritual that somehow made him seem more human and less myth. Evelyn noticed it on the second morning. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that normally wouldn't matter. But here, in the war room, where they were surviving on caffeine, deadlines, and silence, it mattered. She'd been watching from the far end of the table, trying not to watch, trying not to let her thoughts wander to anything other than logic models and encryption trees. But there it was, the same slow pour, the same quiet precision, like he needed the moment to center himself before the storm began again. She hated that she noticed. She hated even more that it made her feel something. Theo, bless him, had delivered another tray of pastries no one touched. And Evelyn was halfway through rewriting the algorithm designed for the 7th time when Graham said something she didn't expect. You remind me of him. She looked up. Your father, he clarified. When you explain the architecture, your voice shifts like you're not explaining it. You're remembering it. She stared at him for a long second, unsure whether to feel flattered or angry. Don't compare us. I'm not trying to flatter you. Good, she said, returning to her screen. It wouldn't work. But something lingered, his words, or the way he'd said them, like someone who had meant to speak days ago and finally gave up resisting. Later, she found herself staring at the dry erase board, marker in hand, but unable to write. There was a question Graham had asked yesterday that she'd dismissed too quickly, about load balancing under legacy networks. It had annoyed her at the time, too simplistic, too obvious. But now, the idea pulsed at the edges of her thoughts. Maybe not wrong, just different. She turned around to find him half asleep on the couch in the corner, head tilted back, tie loosened, coffee still in hand. His phone was buzzing with a reminder he hadn't heard. It struck her suddenly how tired he looked, not just physically. There were lines beneath his eyes that no skincare brand could fix, the weariness of someone who'd built empires but never made peace with them. She remembered what her father once said about people like Graham Callister. Some men build walls to keep others out. Some build them so no one sees how much they're falling apart inside. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn was sketching something new, a modification of Graham's earlier idea, built into her quantum layer structure. She didn't tell him right away. Instead, she slid the draft across the table and waited. Graham studied it, then looked up, almost surprised. You used my suggestion. I didn't say it was a bad one, she replied. I said it was incomplete. And now it's better. He gave a small nod. No smugness. No, I told you so. Just that quiet shift again, like something inside him had released its grip on being right all the time. That night, they worked later than planned, not because of the deadline, because, for once, the war room felt different. Not warm, not friendly, but mutual. The silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like rhythm. At one point, Evelyn spilled her tea, a clumsy accident she immediately cursed herself for. But Graham didn't comment, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just handed her a clean napkin and said, "Happens to the best of us." And something in the simplicity of it, the absence of performance, made her pause. After midnight, she stood at the window while Graham packed up the files. Below them, the city sparkled, a tapestry of light and motion, oblivious to the two people trying to rewrite a future they once broke. "You're quieter tonight," he said behind her. She didn't turn around. Thinking. She hesitated, about what happens when people stop hating each other, but still don't know how to trust. He didn't respond, but when she finally turned to face him, she found him looking at her the way people look at photographs from a different life, not with longing, but with something softer, something like understanding. The rain returned sometime after 2 ms. It wasn't the wild, angry storm of earlier nights. This one was slower, steadier, a quiet drumbeat against the glass, as if the sky itself had grown tired of shouting and finally settled into a whisper. Inside the war room, the timer on the screen read 33:08:11. Evelyn Hartman sat curled in the far corner of the room, legs pulled up beneath her, a faded cardigan draped over her shoulders. Her laptop lay forgotten on the table, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat in a document neither of them had touched in over an hour. Across from her, Graham Callister stood at the whiteboard, staring blankly at a diagram they both knew by heart. He wasn't really looking at it, not anymore. They'd stopped pretending to work. It happened slowly, the conversation slipping away from code and infrastructure into longer silences, more personal remarks. One comment turned into another. One pause stretched into the past. Until finally, Graham said it. I was at the funeral. Evelyn looked up, caught off guard. You didn't speak to anyone, he continued. You stood by the far tree, black coat, hands in your pockets. You didn't cry. She swallowed. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, closer. I knew you were there, she said quietly, but I couldn't look at you. Graham exhaled, a sound more weary than breathy. I didn't expect you to. A pause. Then Evelyn asked the question that had been sitting between them since the beginning. Why did you do it? Graham turned toward her, the overhead lights making him look older than usual. His tie was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. There was no armor left in him. You mean the acquisition? I mean the dismantling. You didn't just take Hartman Technologies. You gutted it, sold off departments, shelved the software, fired half the team. Why, he moved to the table and sat across from her. No posturing, no rehearsed defense, just stillness. Because I was afraid. That surprised her. I had just lost a deal, a big one. Investors were calling for my resignation. I needed something revolutionary to prove I was still relevant. Your father's work was the most advanced I'd ever seen, but it was messy, idealistic. He wanted to change the world. I just wanted to stabilize mine. Evelyn stared at him, unmoving. I didn't understand the technology. Graham continued. I understood its value, but not its heart. And that made me think I could control it, rebrand it, strip it down until it fit into neat boxes investors could understand. He rubbed his face with both hands. By the time I realized what I'd destroyed, it was too late. Silence. Not cold, just full. Then Evelyn whispered, He trusted you, I know. She nodded slowly, voice trembling now. I remember the last night he came home from the lab. He looked tired more than usual, and he said, Sometimes, the thing that breaks your heart isn't what someone did to you. It's realizing they never saw you clearly to begin with. Her voice cracked on the last word. She didn't cry. Not exactly, but the weight of tears lived in every breath. Graham sat still, his hands clenched together like they could hold the moment still. I see you now, he said softly. Evelyn laughed a single hollow sound. That's the tragedy, isn't it? You see me now, but the girl who needed to be seen, she's long gone. She stood abruptly, walking to the window. Below them, the city glowed in orange and gold, lights blinking like tiny truths. She rested her forehead against the cool glass. Graham didn't follow, but he didn't leave either. I used to dream about setting your building on fire, she said, her tone somewhere between confession and exhaustion. Just leveling it, watching the legacy you built collapse the way mine did. I believe you. She turned, surprised by his lack of defense. I would have deserved it, he added. Another pause. Then, what stopped you? Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the floor, to the shadows between them. "My father," she whispered. "Even in his last weeks, he said you had vision, that you just needed someone to challenge your arrogance. And you accepted that." "No," she said. "I hated him for it." She walked back to the table slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "But maybe I understand it now." They sat again, and for the first time, Evelyn reached into her folder and pulled out a faded sheet of paper. She placed it in front of him. The letter. Graham looked down at the signature at the bottom. Raymond Hartman. He read it once, then again. By the time he finished, something had changed in his posture. His shoulders sank, his jaw tightened. And for the first time in years, Evelyn saw him not as the man who took everything, but as a man who lost just as much and simply never knew how to mourn it. He looked up, eyes glassy. "Why give this to me now? Because I'm tired of carrying it alone," she said. The timer on the wall kept counting down. 32, 59, 44. And between 2 cups of untouched coffee and a letter that should have burned, something shifted. Not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of it. The war room felt different the next morning. Not warmer, not lighter, but aligned. For the first time in 3 days, Evelyn Hartman and Graham Callister worked in rhythm, not forced, not wary, just in step. It wasn't that their wounds had healed overnight. They hadn't, but the silence between them had changed its weight. It no longer brimmed with resentment. It held focus, intention. Something new was growing in the space. Grief had once filled respect. They began reviewing the updated encryption framework at 6:15 a.m. Evelyn led the session, pointing to refinements on the Hartman layer, a modular protocol designed to scale across both quantum and traditional infrastructures. Graham didn't interrupt her once. He listened, took notes, and when she paused, he asked the right questions, not to challenge, but to understand. At 7:45, Evelyn handed him a revised architecture chart, one built from her core algorithm, but layered with Graham's earlier suggestion for redundancy simulation. He blinked at the page. "You actually used it." "I told you," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It wasn't a bad idea. It just needed guardrails." Graham studied the diagram again. "This is good," he said. "Really good." "No," she replied. "It's ours." That word lingered longer than expected. He looked up, met her gaze, and nodded once, not like a CEO approving a plan, but like a person quietly grateful for being seen beyond his title. They worked through lunch without realizing it. Theo came in with sandwiches and coffee this time. They actually remembered to eat. Graham, half focused on an export file, bit into his sandwich and froze. "What is this?" Evelyn didn't look up. "Roast beef with horseradish and arugula." He blinked again. "It's amazing. That's why I always order it." Graham glanced at her. "You eat this often, every milestone delivery, every all-nighter, and the day I got my first patent approved." He smiled, not smugly, not performatively, just a small, honest smile. The kind that creases at the corners and disappears quickly, like a secret you didn't mean to share. By 3:00 p.m., they were reviewing the final technical appendix for the Colton Tech merger. Evelyn was standing at the board, reworking an explanation on quantum tunneling logic for non-technical stakeholders, when Graham leaned against the table and said, "You know, I used to think I was the smartest person in every room." She glanced over her shoulder, and now he shrugged. "Now I realize I was often the loudest." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying I'm smarter?" "I'm saying," he replied, "you're the first person who's ever made me want to be smarter." She paused, not because she didn't know how to respond, but because it had been so long since a compliment had landed without condition. That evening, they stood side by side at the large windows, watching New Haven turn gold under a descending sun. The city pulsed with light and shadow, as if unsure whether to let the night win. Evelyn sipped her tea. Graham held his third black coffee. "I used to think redemption had to be dramatic," she said softly. "Public, big speeches, grand gestures." He looked over at her. "And now I think it's quiet, personal, repetitive. He nodded. Like, trust. Exactly. They didn't say more, because sometimes the most honest part of a conversation is what doesn't get spoken at all. At 8:00 p.m., they finalized the technical section. Evelyn hit the save button, closed her laptop, exhaled. We're ready, she said. Graham looked across the table at her. No, he said gently. We're ready. At 8:01 a.m. The boardroom doors swung open with the hushed gravity of a courtroom. Evelyn Hartman stepped in first navy suit, hair pulled into a simple chignon, the kind that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. Graham Callister followed, straight-backed, composed, crisp in his tailored charcoal suit. This wasn't their war room. This was the proving ground. Waiting for them at the table was the Colton delegation, a trio of suits from finance and legal, and at the head sat Dr. Vivian Monroe, Colton Tech's chief technology officer and daughter of the company's founder. She didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply watched. And that was more unsettling than anything she could have said. Evelyn took her place at the front. Graham stood just behind, a half step to the right, not looming, not leading, supporting. Vivian leaned forward. You have 20 minutes, she said. After that, I'll ask questions. Fair warning, I don't believe in soft landings. Evelyn nodded once. We don't need one. The screen lit up. What followed wasn't showmanship. It wasn't theatrics. Evelyn walked through the architecture with precision and clarity, translating highly complex systems into structured logic without diluting its depth. Graham complemented her explanation with brief insights, mainly for the non-technical stakeholders, grounding it in use case practicality. Halfway through, even the skeptical finance exec started taking notes. But Vivian didn't blink. When Evelyn concluded, she clicked off the screen and folded her hands on the table. Quantum encryption, she said, doesn't have to be 5 years away. It just has to be built by people who stopped asking if it's possible and started asking how to make it accessible. Silence. Then Vivian spoke. I have 3 questions, she said. Evelyn waited. 1. How are you planning to handle quantum decoherence at commercial scale? Evelyn was ready. We don't suppress decoherence. We distribute it. That's what the Hartman layer is for quantum load balancing across modular nodes. The noise becomes part of the architecture instead of a threat to it. Vivian nodded, slowly. 2. Your software architecture suggests asynchronous integration with legacy systems. Why not force a complete infrastructure overhaul because we don't want to sell an ultimatum, Graham said. We want to offer evolution. Not everyone can afford to start from scratch, but with our model, they won't have to. Vivian's eyes flicked between the two of them. Then came the 3rd question, and it wasn't technical. Why should we trust you? The words landed like a gavel. Not the system, not the pitch, them. Evelyn stood a little straighter. Because we've failed before, she said. And we're not here pretending we haven't. Vivian's expression didn't change. Evelyn continued, her voice steady but intimate, not performed, but lived. I watched the company my father built collapse. I blamed Graham Callister for years, and I was right, in part. But I also buried the part of me that knew I couldn't bring it back by burning everything down. She looked toward Graham. He didn't flinch. We've rebuilt this together, line by line, not out of nostalgia, out of necessity. Because the world needs a security model built on more than market strategy. It needs one built on truth and accountability. Silence again. Then Vivian sat back in her chair and, for the first time, smiled. The deal wasn't signed that morning. It wouldn't be not for a few more days. But the room shifted, the conversation turned, and as the Colton team filed out, one by one, they left behind something Evelyn hadn't felt in years. Respect. When the doors closed behind them, Evelyn let out a long, slow breath. Graham leaned on the edge of the table. You were incredible. She looked at him, tired but resolute. So were you. He smiled, and this time it wasn't faint. It was real, unfiltered, proud. Vivian Monroe doesn't impress easily, he said, and she doesn't smile. Ever. Maybe she just likes watching former Titans admit they were wrong. Graham laughed, soft and low. Then I hope she enjoyed the show. Evelyn picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder. Come on, she said, heading toward the door. Where are we going? You owe me coffee. Again, she glanced at him, a smirk playing at the edge of her mouth. This time, you're buying. Sometimes, what stays with us isn't the success, the headlines, or the deals closed in polished boardrooms. It's the apology never spoken, the trust slowly rebuilt, the moment we choose to understand rather than win. Evelyn and Graham's story reminds us that behind every corporate empire are human hearts, some broken, some healing, and all longing to be seen. But it also asks us to look deeper. How many brilliant minds have been silenced because they didn't fit the mold? How many voices were overlooked, not because they lacked talent, but because they came from the wrong background, gender, or last name? Discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through boardroom choices, missed acknowledgments, and forgotten names on patents. So here's the real question. What kind of world do we build when we finally see each other fully? If this story touched your heart, made you think, or simply reminded you of something true, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because at Shining Stories, every voice matters, and every story, especially the quiet, human ones, deserves to be heard. See you in the next video.